In this video, I'm going to be talking about why I haven't worn pants. Wait, wrong video. I really gotta stop doing that. Let's talk about 3 mechanics in Lost Ark that will not only increase the damage of you and your team, but will also make the fights 1,000 times easier. Let's get right into it and start off with counters. So basically in Lost Ark, the counter mechanic is a certain window of opportunity that bosses will give you to counter their abilities and stun them for a very short period of time. So in order to know when a boss is going to do a counter ability, you will see them glow blue like this. Now the crucial thing here is that you have to be using a counter ability in order to actually counter the boss. So in order to tell if you have a counter ability, you should look at your skill descriptions and you will see something like this that says counter. Yes. Something even more important than that is getting your counter timing down right. With the first couple of bosses, their counterable abilities are quite slow and predictable, so you can actually learn it and get better at them with those. But as you get into the higher and higher tier bosses, the counters are going to become way less predictable and it's going to take a lot more time and practice. Positioning is absolutely crucial when landing these counters on the boss because your attack has to be from in front of the boss. You cannot hit them from the side, you cannot hit them in the back. So for most classes, this plays out in a very risk-reward situation because if you're positioning yourself in front of the boss and you miss that counter, you're going to be taking a buttload of damage. However, if you're a chunky, beefy Chad Lancer like myself, then you could just put up your shield and hit the counter. If you miss it, no problem, you have your shield up, he's not going to do anything. So there'll be a great degree of practice that is required in order to land your counters. Luckily for you, I found a better way than just ramming your head against all the bosses in Guardian raids to actually practice landing your counters. So if you go to the bottom right menu on your screen, you can see something called guides. In the guide section, there's a training room where you can actually practice counters and a bunch of other abilities. So I think counters are something that is significantly important to learn in Lost Ark. Not only are you mitigating the damage that your team would take because you're stunning the boss, but you're also allowing windows of opportunity to use charge and long attacks that do a lot of damage. Next up, let's talk about stagger damage. Just like counters, staggers are an important mechanic to learn in Lost Ark. It'll create a huge window of opportunity for your team to do damage, even bigger than counters, as well as the fact that some bosses actually have a mechanic built in where you have to break their stagger bar or you fail the encounter. So the way stagger operates is by a secondary health bar. So there's 2 different types of health bars you can see. One is the purple health bar underneath the boss's regular health bar, and also sometimes in certain mechanics you'll see an orange bar at the bottom of the boss. Keep in mind that this also applies to Guardian raids, however you don't actually see the stagger bar. So the stagger bar is invisible, but it's still there, so everything still applies. So the way you lower the stagger threshold of these bosses is by using abilities that have stagger damage. Now all stagger abilities are not created equally, so there's actually different tiers of stagger damage, with the least amount of damage being low and the highest amount of damage actually just being called highest. So once the stagger bar is depleted, the enemy will not be able to move and they will not be able to attack you for a certain amount of time. So this is a great opportunity to do some big damage. The time that the boss is immobile is actually much longer than a counter as well, so that's important to notice. In general, I highly recommend learning what abilities do the most amount of stagger damage because later on, there are actually going to be mechanics that require you to do stagger damage, otherwise you'll actually fail the encounter. Lastly is weak point damage. This one was the most confusing for me to understand for my little goldfish deformed brain. If I was ever a boss, that would definitely be my weak point, and it would be like a very small target, so you'd have a hard time hitting it. So when applicable, weak point damage is incredibly influential to winning encounters. So the reason I'm saying if applicable is because for every boss, this is not the case. Some bosses you actually cannot do weak point damage to. However, the bosses that are notorious for having weak points are Chromanium, Nacrocena, and Helgia. So these bosses in particular, you can actually break a part off of them, which makes the fight so much easier. That's why it's so crucial to the success, because it increases your chances of killing the boss so much more. But Astro, you haven't explained how to do it. Alright, calm down, I got you, I'm gonna do it right now. So first thing is you have to identify what abilities have weak point damage. Very similar to the stagger abilities, you have to make sure that the ability says weak point damage on it. These can be either from levels 1 to 2, so it's very similar to the stagger mechanic where they're not all created equally. So the confusing part for me was, even though I'm using weak point abilities, how do I know that I'm actually doing weak point damage? And where the heck are these weak points on these enemies, because no one has told me where they are. So there's two things I figured out. The first thing is that when you do weak point damage to certain bosses, you'll see a little tag saying destruction damage on it. When you see that destruction damage, you know, okay, I'm hitting the back, or I'm hitting the tail, or I'm hitting the front of the boss, right? So you know exactly where the damage should be going. Secondly, there's also certain mechanics where you're going to see a crosshair on the boss. So for example, on Necrosena, when you stagger him, you'll see a crosshair on his tail. And when you see that, you want to do as much weak point damage there as possible, because then you can actually break that part. Depending on your class too, you might actually have a very limited amount of weak point damage, so there's some things you can do to mitigate that. Firstly is using destruction bombs. Destruction bombs will actually do weak point damage to the enemy at level 3 damage. Another really great tool you can take with you is the corrosive bomb. So this will give you an additional level of weak point damage on the boss, which is huge because it affects your teammates' damage as well. Gunlancer benefits insanely from this because most of his abilities are weak damage level 1, and bumping them all up to weak damage level 2 for 20 seconds is insane. So you won't be doing this for most bosses. It's very niche situations where you actually have to do weak damage, but it is important to know because it can make the fights that much easier. So there you go, there's 3 mechanics that'll help you significantly increase your success rate in Guardian raids or dungeons where your team is absolutely slacking. So hopefully that helps. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like. I'll catch you guys next time. Peace.